Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine or have a sense that something isn't quite right? In this channel, we dive deep into the realm of the mysterious and the unknown. From chilling encounters with cryptids to baffling events that defy logic, we explore the stories that will make you completely question your own reality. So settle in, buckle up, and get yourself cozy, because the journey into the unknown begins now. Lena had been training for the Chicago Marathon for months, and her Saturday morning routine had become almost sacred. She'd rise before dawn, lace up her well-worn running shoes, and head out to the Palos trail system just outside the city. It was her favorite spot for long runs, thick with trees, dirt paths winding through the forest, and small streams crossing every few miles. The Palos Trail was popular with cyclists, hikers, and runners alike, but if she timed it right, she could get there before the crowds, enjoying the solitude and the quiet that early morning brought. This particular Saturday was no different. Lena arrived at the Swallow Cliff Woods parking lot around 5:30 a.m. The sun was just beginning to hint at the horizon, casting a faint glow over the treetops. She did her usual pre-run stretches, leaning against her car and yawning as she shook off the last remnants of sleep. It was mid-September, and the air had that crisp, almost biting quality that hinted at the coming fall. She took a deep breath, savoring the coolness that filled her lungs. Setting off at a slow jog, Lena made her way into the trailhead. The ground was still damp from the rain the night before, and the scent of wet earth and pine needles was strong in the air. She moved easily, her steps rhythmic and steady as she followed the winding path deeper into the forest. As the sun slowly climbed, the woods around her came to life with the sounds of rustling leaves, birds calling out to one another, and the occasional squirrel scurrying across the path. Lena knew these trails like the back of her hand. She had mapped out her route in advance, a long loop that would cover nearly 15 miles before circling back to her car. It was about an hour into her run, somewhere near the stretch where the trail narrowed between a thicket of dense shrubs on one side and a steep embankment on the other, that things started to feel off. She couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. There was an odd silence that seemed to settle over the forest, as though someone had hit the mute button on all the usual sounds of nature. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind, which had been rustling the leaves just moments before, seemed to have died down. Lena slowed her pace, her ears straining to pick up anything, any noise that would explain the sudden quiet. Ahead, the path curved sharply to the right. She knew that just beyond the bend, the trail would open up to a small clearing. She hesitated for a second, then shook off the creeping unease. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Maybe a larger animal, deer perhaps, had moved through, startling the birds. It happened sometimes. She picked up her pace again, rounding the bend. The clearing came into view, bathed in the soft, golden light of the early morning. But something stood in the middle of it, something that made her come to an abrupt halt. It was a figure. No, not quite a figure. It was crouched, its back turned toward her, and it was covered in something dark and matted. Fur? Hair? She couldn't quite tell. Lena's heart began to race, a mixture of adrenaline and confusion surging through her. Her mind scrambled to make sense of what she was seeing. It was roughly the size of a person, but its limbs were all wrong. Too long, too thin, and the way it moved was unsettling, like the jerky motions of an insect rather than a mammal. It shifted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that made her stomach drop. A hand, or at least something resembling a hand, with unnaturally long fingers tipped in what looked like sharp claws. Her instinct screamed at her to back away, eyes locked on the creature. It seemed to be occupied with something on the ground, hunched over in a way that made it look almost human. Almost. Lena took a slow, shaky step backward, hoping to go unnoticed. The creature suddenly paused, its head twitching upward as if it had sensed her movement. It turned slightly, just enough for her to see the side of its face, or where a face should have been. Instead, there was a smooth, featureless expanse, broken only by a wide, thin slit that might have been a mouth. A surge of terror shot through her. She turned and ran, bolting back the way she had come. Her feet pounded the earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps as branches and leaves whipped past her face. She didn't dare look back, didn't want to see if it was following her. The silence had broken now. She could hear something crashing through the undergrowth behind her, too fast and too erratic to be another runner. She had to think, had to find a way out. The trail was a maze of interconnected paths, and in her panic, she could easily take a wrong turn. She forced herself to focus, scanning her surroundings as she ran. Up ahead, the path split. One fork led deeper into the woods, the other sloped downward toward a small creek. She chose the latter, hoping the water would slow down whatever was chasing her. Reaching the creek, Lena didn't hesitate. She plunged into the shallow water, splashing across to the other side. The coldness soaked through her shoes and sent a shock up her legs, but she kept moving. Behind her, she heard the creature's footsteps falter at the water's edge. For a brief, fleeting moment, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wouldn't cross the water. Maybe it was bound to the woods, unable to leave its domain. She pushed on, adrenaline propelling her forward as she clambered up the opposite bank and back onto the trail. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she refused to slow down. Every rustle, every crack of a twig sent fresh waves of fear through her, but the sounds of pursuit gradually faded. She dared to glance back over her shoulder. Nothing. The path behind her was empty. Lena didn't stop running until she reached the parking lot. She burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, her clothes soaked with sweat and creek water. She stumbled to her car, fumbling with her keys, hands shaking so badly that she dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door. Climbing inside, she locked the doors as she peered out at the quiet, sunlit forest. She sat there for several minutes, trying to calm herself. It had felt so real, too real. The way it moved, the sound of its steps chasing her. It wasn't something she could easily dismiss. Finally, Lena started the car and drove away, leaving the woods and whatever had been in them behind. She never went back to the Palos Trail after that day. Whenever she told the story, she lived it all over again. Today she's trying to purge it from her mind and get past the horrendous memories that she wishes never had happened. You are probably going to think I am crazy. Well, let me tell you that even I think I'm crazy, and I lived it. I was on vacation with my husband. We had decided that we would go to a state that we hadn't traveled to before, and we decided that South Carolina was where it was at. I always loved the idea of the Carolinas. Anyone I talked to always told me how beautiful they were. It was a no-brainer when we decided to go out of our comfort zone and try somewhere new. I didn't expect that trip to completely destroy my view of South Carolina, but it did. I was so excited because normally when we travel, we go to the same places. Big cities like Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, places on the West Coast, basically. And I was ready for a new adventure. So when my husband said, "Let's go somewhere new and further away," I quickly told him I had been thinking about South Carolina. I wanted the beach and the exciting energy that I always had heard about from friends who had traveled there. However, they all forgot to mention the unnatural creatures that you might find there. We had been in Columbia, South Carolina for a few days, but I was ready to get out of the city and hit some small towns on the way to the beach. I wanted to stay in small hotels along the way and really get to know the locals and the local vibe. The first small town hotel was cute. We had fun eating at the diners in town, shopping, and just taking in the scenery. But all good things come to an end. We moved on to the next town, checked into our room, and went in search of food. By the time we were done eating, it was late-ish. Not quite dusk, but also not night. That perfect time between the two. We were walking back to our hotel, talking about what we wanted to do the next day, and I was trying to convince him that we should go to the antique store that we had passed on our way into town. I was enjoying the walk and had almost convinced him when we saw movement in the shadows. I wrote it off as just someone walking home. We had never been in this town before, so I didn't know any better. I felt slightly uneasy, but I didn't let it stop me. I was determined to go antique shopping the next day. My husband and I were laughing as we hit the parking lot of the hotel. However, my laughter quickly stopped when I saw movement again. Something was very, very off. I rushed us into our hotel room, locking the door behind us, my nerves screaming that something was wrong, but I couldn't place the fear. It made no sense, but I knew that I wanted out of this town as fast as possible. It was a weird but very strong feeling. I let my husband know that maybe we should just move on in the morning, which he said made no sense. He said that I had gotten him excited to go to the shop and that we should just leave tomorrow night like we planned. He assured me that we would be fine. I didn't want to fight about it, so I agreed, and we headed to bed. To be honest, I struggled to sleep that night. The next morning I felt foolish. Of course, there would be things I was unfamiliar with in this town. I had never been there. It was all new to me. My husband and I spent the day trying a new diner, picking antiques and checking out the little town shops, buying souvenirs and postcards to send ourselves from on the road. I was feeling very comfortable as our day came to an end, and we loaded the car with our suitcases. I was ready to get to the next town, check in, and plan out tomorrow. I had no idea that our trip was about to become memorable for a truly terrifying reason. My husband was tired and had a headache coming on, and so I was driving. We had only been on the road for about an hour, but were trying to get closer to the beach before we stopped for the night. But not too close because we weren't ready to pay the higher prices yet. The road was gorgeous, even in the dark. The trees had grown up tall and their branches reached across the road, making a sort of tunnel. Our headlights were shining against the trees and signs, but it wasn't long before the calm night changed to terror. Suddenly, the headlights lit up a strange figure. We were out in the middle of nowhere, so at first we just thought it was weird, and we were worried that it was someone needing a ride. So we pulled off the road and turned our hazards on. I opened the door, leaned out, and asked if everything was okay. I immediately knew I had made a bad decision. The figure had been crouched down, and when it stood, it towered over the height it should have been if it was human. But the thing was clearly not human. It then swung this lizard-like head around to stare at me. As it did so, its tongue flicked out in a way that seemed to be smelling my presence. My breath caught in my throat, and my husband started pulling on my shirt to get me back in the car. I jumped back in our car and shut my door. I didn't even have the chance to put our car in drive before the creature was jumping on the hood. The yellow eyes are something I will never forget. My husband started yelling at me to hold on as the lizard-like thing started scratching its huge claws down the hood of our car. I frantically fumbled our car into gear, slamming on the gas and praying that I could get this thing off of our car before it comes through the windshield. But it just dug its claws deeper into the hood. I slammed on the brakes, which threw the creature onto the ground in front of us. My husband screamed, "Go!" And I went. I went around the creature and floored it, getting us as far from the area as I could. We were both shaking as we made it into the next town, but we decided that we were just going to keep going. We didn't want to risk whatever it was finding us again. From now on, I am going to be looking into all of the reports of creepy and irrational creatures in an area before we decide to travel there. I'm all good on getting myself into a situation like this again. I've had my fill, and I consider us lucky to be here to tell the tale. Hey Lilith, I love your show and have come to realize it's a safe space for people who've encountered the unexplained, so I finally feel comfortable enough to share my own story. I grew up around Point Pleasant. As a kid, the Mothman was ubiquitous. Everyone had a story. Relatives, neighbors, even friends' brothers' roommates. You get the idea. Just hearing about it always gave me the chills. My parents divorced when I was young, and my mom and I eventually moved out of Point Pleasant. I was an only child, and I'd spend the summers with my dad. I loved him, but I didn't feel like I connected with him back then. He used to take me camping a lot. He was an outdoorsman, and he loved introducing me to the beauty of nature. It was okay, but honestly, I would have rather watched movies or played video games. During one of our trips, I wandered from our site to gather wood for a fire. The sun had already gone down, and it was getting dark pretty quick. I wandered a bit too far, and as I looked around, I didn't see my dad or our tent. That's when I heard a strange clicking sound coming from up in the trees. I looked up and froze, dropping the sticks in my hands. A shadowy figure was perched high in the branches, maybe 20 feet up. 2 glowing red eyes pierced the darkness, staring at me. They were big and round, and I remember being held under their spell, like I was hypnotized. I was convinced it was the Mothman. The branches creaked as the creature stood up and spread its massive wings. It swooped down from the tree, shrieking. I ducked and covered my eyes and felt a gust of wind as it skimmed over me. I stayed curled up in a ball, screaming until I felt my dad pick me up and hug me. I said it was the Mothman as I sobbed uncontrollably. He calmed me down, and we walked back to our tent where he cooked us a dinner of hot dogs and canned beans. We ate in silence, and he could tell I was still bothered by the experience. We heard an owl in the trees, and he said that a lot of times owls are mistaken for the Mothman. He took out a flashlight and shined it around the trees, trying to find the owl. Sure enough, he caught it, and its eyes reflected an orange-red glow. The owl flew off after being identified, but I was sure the creature I saw was much bigger. I asked him what the Mothman was. He thought for a moment, then said it was a force of nature that we just don't understand. But it shouldn't be feared. Instead, it should be revered and respected. I had never heard the Mothman described in that way, and I asked him if he ever saw it himself. He paused thoughtfully, smiled, and shook his head. No. Normally after dinner, we'd stargaze, and my dad would point out the constellations, but I just went in the tent and tried to go to sleep. That night, I had a horrible dream with vivid imagery of fire, broken glass, and twisted metal. At the time, I had no idea what it meant, but it was so real, I woke up screaming. Once again, my dad had to calm me down. When I told him about my dream, he gave me a strange look. We weren't scheduled to leave until the following afternoon, but I was so unnerved, I begged to go home early. My dad was a good sport and didn't complain. As we packed our stuff, I felt guilty and apologized for ruining the trip. He reassured me that everything would be okay and that we'd make up for it with a movie night. As soon as we got onto Route 62, I felt much better. The next day, we were watching TV in the afternoon, and a breaking news story interrupted the program. Apparently, there was a major pile-up on Route 62 after a big rig overturned. Several cars were involved, and there were fatalities. It snarled traffic in both directions for hours. My dad commented that it happened on the same route we took home. If we stuck to our schedule and left the campground when we were originally supposed to, we very well could have been involved with that accident. He continued watching the news in silence before finally turning to me and admitting that he did see the Mothman once when he was in high school. At least he thought he did. He and some friends were driving along Route 62 one night, drag racing. He knew it was a stupid thing to do, but they were just teenagers. Suddenly, a winged creature started following them. No matter how fast they drove, it easily kept up. He said it was dark, and he couldn't make out its features, but he never forgot its large, red, glowing eyes. He and his friends slowed down, and the creature disappeared. That night, he had a dream exactly like the one I had. He thought it was a warning and vowed never to race again. Unfortunately, his friend died in a car wreck a few weeks later while drag racing. That really shook him up. Also, one of the things you hear about the Mothman is that he's a harbinger of doom. like the infamous Silver Bridge collapse in 1967 that more or less introduced him to the world. While some blamed him for that event and other tragedies over the years, my dad believed that the Mothman was just an omen, and that how you interpret it is entirely up to you. I know some will say he's evil personified, a servant of the devil or something like that. I don't think he's either good or evil, he just is. He doesn't pick sides. But if you see him, set aside your fear and pay attention to what he's trying to tell you. I don't know what I actually saw that night in the forest. It was dark, and my overactive kid imagination immediately saw a monster. But like my dad said, and even proved, it could have been an owl. I can't help but think that the sighting and my dream were the Mothman trying to warn me, just like he warned my dad. I wondered how many other people he appeared to, and how many of them listened. The relationship between me and my dad changed that summer. We became closer. I guess sharing bizarre experiences will do that. I haven't seen the Mothman since, but I haven't been afraid either. My dad is old now and we don't go camping like we used to, but I cherish every moment with him. In some way, the Mothman taught me that. Life is fleeting and never take it for granted.